child's a part of a family that is part of a church. And for parents, and you talked about not wanting to say no to the kids, going to be wanting to make the kids happy, and they've invested. They have a higher level of investment of money in this, and so they're like, well, if I'm going to spend all this money, then my kid better succeed at this. Like I want a return on my investment, and so then they're putting more emotional energy and time to these kind of things, to the neglect of their soul, to the neglect of the things of the Lord, and so it can just be a vicious cycle.
Yeah, I agree. I think often it becomes a major hindrance when it allows people to miss church or even family worship times. I think majorly church, and it's common with these kind of extracurriculars that they get in the way of church. They're creeping into Sunday. I think when we were children, and even more so when our parents were children, there was respect for Sunday as being at least a family time, probably more of a family time than a spiritual time. But there was not an encroaching onto Sunday. But, I know many that even spiritual leaders in churches that have to choose between whether or not to allow their child to participate in their sport or their event to its fullest or going to church on Sunday. So I think often it becomes a hindrance by forcing them to miss church. It's not really forcing them. They're making a decision. Or even, force them to miss time of family worship, studying the Word together, because they're just too busy and because they don't have time together ever as a family all together. I think it also can be a hindrance to our children and youth. I've known of youth that have told me, I don't have time to study the Bible myself. I don't have time for personal devotions. That Pastor Tony, how could you expect me to be studying the Bible on my own? I've got all of these activities. I've got all these sports, all these extra events, and ultimately it's really hurting them rather than giving them any long-term help in that way. I think even when time is available, even when we have time available to go to church and stuff like that, and there's some free time, the major allotment of extracurriculars versus sometimes more spiritually focused things can tend to portray a priority of the extracurricular over that which can be sometimes more important, though the extracurricular can certainly be used to glorify the Lord. But lastly, I'd say, and a major thing that has actually shown itself in the secular world, as oftentimes youth and children today have anxiety issues that they've never had before, and they feel stressed out and they feel anxious about things, and sometimes that's due to overcommitment to extracurriculars and feeling that they have to keep up and they have to be able to measure up to their peers in the amount of extracurriculars and how well they do in extracurriculars. So I think there's a lot of hindrance in that kind of thing.
Oh, there's a lot there. That's good.
Now, what impact does this have on parental discipleship?
I think it doesn't have to, but it tends to get put aside. And especially, like you've talked about this, but if it means missing church regularly, then it ends up modeling to the kids that, well, this thing that we're going after is really more important. And God doesn't really mind. It's okay. We'll do this for a while, and then we'll come back to church. And so, now there are some families that maybe if they're away at some sort of tournament or whatever, or just regular games on when the church is gathering, particularly on Sunday. There's no explicit teaching in Scripture that we're supposed to gather midweek. Probably a lot of churches still do that, and probably a lot of people listening, their churches do. But the Bible doesn't tell us we have to do that. So I think if you're regularly missing when the whole church is gathering, it just sets up problems, and then probably parents are not filling in those gaps. But even if they were, they shouldn't. Scripture tells us to regularly assemble for the purpose of encouraging. It's not just to get fed a sermon, though that's part of it. But it talks about gathering together to push each other on to love and good deeds. So we talked about that. I think the episode just got put up about the church, and so it's not just a religious drive-through for us.
Yeah.
Well, what do you?
Yeah, so I think it can also, in addition to that, give the message that faith is just one of the buffet choices in life. And involvement in Christianity is just, I mean, just like you can choose volleyball, you can choose baseball, you can choose to give more time to this activity versus the other one. I mean, the Christian life is just a buffet choice, and you choose to have a little bit of this on your plate and then maybe a lot more of that other thing. But rather than understanding the faith as something that encompasses all and changes how we approach every hour of our day. But I think even more than that, I think this over-elevating this communicates that children and youth should see these kind of involvements as their identity. And I think that's a huge issue. And, so I'm going to be, to try to be nice and not to pick on anybody, I'm going to talk about dressage involvement. So dressage is the most ridiculous sport that's ever come into existence. And if you participate in dressage, you're welcome to no longer listen to our podcast. I pick on it. But no, just kidding. But say a youth participates in dressage. I can so often see a teenager or a child finding their identity in that, I'm a dressage player, and who I am is this dressage player that relates mainly to their dressage buddies. I don't know that that's as much going to happen as other sports, unfortunately, because dressage is ridiculous. But, that kind of perspective that sees themselves as first and foremost, who am I? What do I do I'm a dressage player. And I think even in that, seeing their faith is less essential to who they are and how they relate to people than their dressage involvement. But I think in a less ridiculous way, if you fill in the blank with any other activity or sports, I'm sure parents and workers in children and youth ministry can understand exactly the problem that I'm talking about.
I think that's a good point about just building. You're spending all this time and energy on it, and it does pass on. This is how you should define yourself. And I learned something new. I'd never even heard of dressage. I had to look it up. Like, what is this? And if it was some sort of Harry Potter made up, was that Quidditch or something?
Dressage
whatever that game
is.
I didn't read Harry Potter as a kid. Not because I thought it was devilry. I just wasn't interested. But.
Yeah. Mitt Romney famously owned a dressage horse that was in the Olympics.
Oh, that's right.
It's
okay.
in the Olympics.
All right. That's right.
What over-elevated desires do you think lead to over-elevation of extracurriculars?
Well, definitely material success, popularity, acceptance. And I think that's on the part of both the kids and the parents. I mean, no parent wants their kid to be, rejected and ridiculed. It's a good thing to want your child to be accepted, but at what cost, you got to ask. And so parents wanting their kid to get a great job, making great money, those kinds of things, I think that can lead to then the parent even pushing towards some of those kind of things, or being willing to kind of go with the flow on that and not say, no, we're not going to do that. That's too much. I know there's a podcast that I listened to, some found helpful, D6. They, in their old intro, they changed it up, but they had a quote, David Platt speaking at some conference, and he said, our goal in parenting is not for our kids to get a great education, as great as a thing as that is, or that they get a great job, making great money, and that they go on great dates and find a great spouse and live in a great house and have great kids and just repeat the cycle. Our goal is that they love a great God. And so often, though, parents within the church, too, they have goals that are shaped more by the world and loves that are shaped more by the world around them. And so when you have those goals, then those desires that, again, they're not bad in of themselves, they can lead to that over-elevation like you're talking about.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. That's really good. And I don't think I have really much to add to. I think that's a really excellent response. But I think over-elevated desires that are sometimes good desires are just really where idolatry comes from. It's when we have a right desire, sometimes a good one, and we elevate it to a point where it becomes a need, where it becomes something that we worship at, and oftentimes extracurriculars can be that. How do churches sometimes just add to the extracurricular busyness, Ben?
Well, having all sorts of activities to keep kids, and I think especially with the segment that you're working with youth, students, teenagers, whatever, it can be even bigger there because they're more mobile. They want to go hang out with their friends, this kind of thing. And so just to keep them busy, and even if it's a constant service project, and that's good, but just filling up a family's calendar with these extra things to go to, just so that we can sort of justify that we're doing something.
Yeah. I think you're very much right. Yeah, I think that is so to the point of it. I think there are many churches that kind of act like, with extracurriculars and over-involvement of youth and children, well, if you can't beat them, join them. Just add to the overall busyness and the craziness, like we've talked about in a different podcast. But and I've known of a church that had their own Wednesday night stuff for at night, had multiple sports leagues that they expected kids to participate in, and then had a something like Scouts that they wanted to encourage their children and youth to participate in. And I forgot what other else. I think they had some kind of like debate club or something like that they really wanted to push that to their children and youth to be in. And I actually think maybe that church is starting to create its own idols rather than helping families fight idols in those cases. Now, how can churches respond to this, both seriously and graciously?
I think churches can do that in a number of ways, and it can come from those in leadership, but also just the one anothering of the church, raising good questions of other people. And so that can come across in sermon application. That's in some ways going to be some of the most effective when the whole church is hearing it, and they're hearing it from the primary preacher, sort of pushing against some of those cultural idols and places we draw our identity from, and kids are drawing their identity from. But I think it's got to go beyond that. I think you could have a parent forum or some sort of thing where you get parents together and you just address the topic head on. You got to be careful, and there is issues of Christian liberty here, but at the same time, there's issues of wisdom, and you can't establish this hard and fast line. But at the same time, you can see people's tendencies and the trajectory, and so just addressing that in personal conversations, but also you ask about churches adding to the busyness, and sort of if we can't beat them, join them. Don't join them. Intentionally don't just stock the calendar full of stuff just to have it on there. Try to be strategic about the things that you do have on the calendar and be willing to cut things out. So I don't know, what are your thoughts?
I think those are all really excellent inputs, and I don't know that I have a ton to add to that in terms of how we can deal with it seriously and promote that good vision. But one thing I do want to kind of state that you talked about a little bit earlier is that I do want to say bluntly, no matter how we approach this, missing youth group, missing Awana, missing whatever midweek or Sunday night activity the church has in addition to the normal Sunday services, is in for football practice, for dance class, for involvement in the school play, is in no way, shape, or form a sin. And I think any church leaders that try to communicate that it is sin, that it's inherently wrong, are going far beyond what Scripture says, that are going far beyond, I think, God's will in that, and can be dangerous in that sense. There's a lot of benefits from things like Awana. I love the idea of going to youth group. I think there's a lot of benefits in that kind of thing, but it's nowhere scripturally mandated. And if your child or youth is getting spiritually poured into at home, that and at church on Sundays, that can be enough, as long as we are encouraging them in the Lord, and as long as we're seeing that faith as part of their active everyday life. But if you think that involvement in those kind of things is the neglect of involvement in church, maybe that's a decision your family needs to make. But again, we need to be gracious, and we need to never make parents the enemy or children and youth the enemy if they don't come out on Wednesday nights, or if they don't come out Sunday night or Tuesday morning. If you have something Tuesday morning, I don't know.
Right.
Now, should we just pull our kids out of everything and live out in the woods?
Maybe.